We don't know much about the life of Mike Reuschel. Since he was a child, he always behaved as a very reserved person. So, throughout his life, he was careful with his inner circle and the information that got out. Therefore, even after the events happened and his life became the focus of public attention, not much information about him was discovered. We know that Mike attended the University of Florida, where he studied dentistry, and even though Mike was still very young, he always knew exactly who he wanted to become. One of his ambitions was to achieve professional and financial success. So, for most of the time he spent at university, he focused on his goals. However, almost unexpectedly, Mike met Didi Hoffman. Like him, Didi was 19 years old and had a vision of life quite similar to his. Although both of them were extremely young, they weren't at university to have fun, but to build their futures. Which meant that they didn't want to waste time on meaningless relationships either, which, instead of making them break up, allowed this relationship to become serious quickly. After a few months as a couple, the two young people got engaged, and by the time they finished their respective studies, they were already married. For many, the choice to marry was too rushed. Moreover, many thought that the couple would end up getting divorced relatively quickly, since they were very young and had only known each other for a short time. Incredibly, after graduating, the couple moved to a beautiful house in Gainesville, Florida. And besides starting to build their respective careers, which again were very important to them, they also started a family together. They had 2 daughters, Caroline and Kate, while they were still little girls. Michael's career went very well. He started a business selling supplies and technology for dental offices, and it kept getting better and better for him. And although this allowed the family to do better financially, it meant that Mike spent much more time focused on his work. And the situation only got worse as his business became more successful. Instead of delegating certain responsibilities, instead of hiring more people and giving them a share of all that work, Mike became addicted to going to the office, even spending months on business trips. Naturally, this wore down not only his relationship with his wife, but also with his daughters, who barely saw him at home. Despite this, Didi and Mike were married for 25 years, until in 2005, by mutual agreement, they decided to get divorced. There were no clear reasons for the couple's separation. There had been no infidelity between them, nor a problem that was impossible to solve. The relationship had simply worn out too much, and they believed it was better to end their marriage. It was definitely much wiser to end things in a good way like this, and not when something actually happened that would hurt both of them and also their daughters. Like the house they had in Gainesville, which was very close to the University of Florida, where they hoped their daughters would attend someday. As soon as they finished high school, they agreed that the 2 girls would live there, since Mike didn't want to sell the house or leave the place. He ended up giving Didi her share of the money, and she used that large sum to move and settle comfortably somewhere else. However, Caroline and Kate didn't last long living with their father. When it was time to go to college, both of them chose to live on campus or with their friends. Mike, 49 years old, inherited the huge mansion, leaving him alone in the house by himself. Being a single, successful, and still young man, Mike decided to give online dating a try, something he had never tried before. After browsing websites, he made a Match.com profile, Thank You, which is specifically designed for an older audience who are looking to meet other people their age and so on. It was there that he came across the profile of Susan O'Brien, a 38-year-old woman who was a nurse. Mike found this woman attractive from the beginning, and as soon as they matched, he didn't hesitate to ask her out on a date, after which he ended up even more in love. Sue seemed like a very charismatic and interesting woman to him, so that first date was followed by a second and so on until it became a serious relationship. After 2 years of dating, Mike proposed to Sue, promising that he wouldn't make the same mistakes as in his previous relationship. That is, he wouldn't put his work and business as a priority over his personal life. Believing these words, Sue accepted, and in August 2007 the couple got married. At first, Sue moved into the house that Mike already had in Gainesville. But since it was where he had lived with his ex-wife, the couple decided to start looking for a new home where they could begin their own story. They decided to buy a very beautiful house in the Hale Golf and Country Plantation in Gainesville. And the house they bought, although it was huge, it wasn't exactly a mansion, even though it had many comforts. A wood-burning stove, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. Moreover, it was situated in a gated community with all the luxuries that this specific one offered. Aside from living in a house that many considered a dream, Mike was staying true to his promise to enjoy his life beyond work. That's why it was very common to see how he and Sue spent much of their free time traveling. And when they couldn't do it, even so, they spent a lot of time together going to fancy restaurants, taking walks, and doing activities together. In general, the life of the Russells seemed perfect. They always appeared happy, and they also had the financial means that many people dream of. So no one could have imagined that in reality it was a marriage that would become more and more toxic over the years. Mike's friends and family, who had to get used to Sue's presence in their lives, described the nurse as a very possessive person. According to them, after marrying the businessman, Sue believed she had the right to everything he owned. And that included everything from his house, his money, and even, for example, the dog that his daughters had left in Mike's care. She directly thought that everything that belonged to her husband was hers. This led to some mutual rejection between Mike and his family, particularly his daughters, from the start. There's something we have to admit. Both Caroline and Kate had grown up in a family that already had a lot of money. They were used to a high standard of living, and especially to their father never saying no to them. Maybe because he felt guilty for not being present during several stages of their lives, or simply because he wanted to give them everything and he could. But Mike kept giving them large sums of money even when both of them were already adults, which for some reason bothered Sue a lot. She had become the stereotype of the evil stepmother, and basically the family couldn't stand her. Although Sue's complaints about not setting boundaries for his daughters were a bit hypocritical, considering she lived off her husband's money, Mike tried to keep the peace at home. He would simply talk to his daughters when she wasn't around and agree to give them money without his wife knowing, which worked for a while. However, when the eldest Caroline announced that she was going to marry her boyfriend and started planning the wedding, it became quite obvious that Michael was financing the wedding, which was way above the budget that 2 young people could afford. We're talking about approximately $90,000, which included the price of Ojika Castle, which is literally a castle located in New York. As you can imagine, obviously, how expensive a wedding can get right from the start in New York and in a kind of castle, which made it even worse because the couple was planning to celebrate for an entire weekend. The wedding was scheduled for November 2017. Not wanting to lie to his wife and anticipating the complaints she might make, Michael ended up telling her that he had given his daughter $100,000 for the wedding arrangements. Which is perfectly fine, he's completely within his rights because it's his daughter. However, as the wedding approached, the tension between her and Mike kept increasing. It was obvious that the amount of money he had invested in his daughter's wedding was much higher than what they had agreed on, and everything ended up exploding on November 20th, 2017. That day, a huge argument broke out between the two of them at their house in Gainesville. The fight escalated so much that Sue ended up calling the police. When the officers arrived, it was the nurse who was more out of control, and it was an attempt to keep things from escalating further. They ordered her to go out to the beach inside the gated community so the situation could cool down. Sue did not comply with this order and ended up being arrested 30 minutes later. This also led to her facing domestic assault charges, since she had pushed her husband to get out of the house. In the end, Mike decided not to press charges, so the charges were dropped. This incident caused a sort of separation in the marriage. Sue moved out of the Gainesville house, but their relationship was never completely over. By January 2018, they reconnected, and in February, Sue visited Mike in Gainesville for a weekend. It was during that weekend that the events took place. Around 3:30 in the morning on February 3rd, 2018, the Gainesville police received a call. It came from the Reuschel house, and the caller was actually Mike, who was extremely nervous. Mike. So he calls 911 in a rather desperate way and starts telling the emergency operator that a masked intruder had entered his house armed with a knife and had attacked him and his wife, injuring Sue. Obviously, this is a pretty urgent emergency. So immediately, a police car and paramedics were sent to the couple's house where they arrived, to a much calmer scene than they expected to see. The garden of the house was perfect, and all the lights in the house were off, giving the impression that everything inside was fine. The inside of the house was just as calm until Mike heard them and came over, guiding them to one of the rooms. On the bed, surrounded by blood, Sue was lying down with several stab wounds in her abdomen, but also on her arms, so she had to be taken immediately to a hospital to be treated. While Sue was in the hospital, the police took Mike's statement and searched the couple's house for any trace of the alleged intruder. However, they suddenly realized something was off about Mike's story. In their house, there was nothing of value missing, no drawers were open, and nothing was out of place to suggest that a thief had broken in looking for something to steal. But that wasn't the only thing the detectives found suspicious. The idea that someone could have entered this luxurious gated community, evading all its security, seemed illogical. Let's also keep in mind that this didn't happen a long time ago. So, it's not like someone could just enter this neighborhood and simply leave as if nothing happened, assuming they could avoid all the security, assuming they could get past the gates. There would be cameras everywhere, at least at the entrances. In fact, outside there are always some cameras with lights for nighttime, so it was very difficult for someone to enter just for that. The detective's suspicions were confirmed when, after coming out of surgery, Sue woke up. In her conversation with the police, she discussed the subject without mentioning any armed intruder, but instead pointed to her husband as the person who had attacked her. By that point, the investigators weren't sure who was telling the truth, so they went back to the house to look for any kind of information that could help them figure out what had really happened. In this second search, they discovered that there was no forced entry. The lock on the front door was intact, there were no broken windows, and there was no other possible entry. But that wasn't all. They discovered that there were security cameras both inside and outside the house. But when they tried to access the security tapes, they found that the recordings from that early morning were suspiciously deleted. When they confronted Mike with this information, the businessman seemed to have an excuse for everything. He said that his wife was clearly confused and didn't remember the events as she thought. For the lack of forced entry, he said that all the doors had been left open that night and the intruder could have easily come in while they were sleeping without making any noise. Mike told his story in a very convincing way, but not enough for the detectives to believe him 100%. Still not fully convinced to believe his version, they decided to check Sue and Mike's cell phones, as well as try to recreate what they had been doing the previous night. When they spoke with Susan again, they learned that on the night of February 2nd, she and her husband had gone to have dinner at one of the fancy restaurants near their home. The idea was to have a nice reconciliation dinner. However, things soon started to get more and more tense between them, to the point where Mike got up while the nurse was still eating. He left some bills on the table and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the woman alone. A few minutes after Michael had left her in that restaurant, the woman took her phone and wrote him a message. "Good luck with your daughter. I'm going to fill out the divorce papers." This was quickly followed by another message. "You have serious problems with your daughter and I'm not going to tolerate them." Afterwards, she sent this message, got up, and took a taxi back to the house where she had to sleep. Although she didn't plan to stay in the same room as Mike, so she decided to sleep that night in a guest room. But her husband was absent. According to what Sue remembered, and as could be confirmed thanks to the location of Mike's phone, the businessman returned home after midnight, heading straight to his room where he expected to find Sue. Not finding her made him even angrier. Furious, he started looking for her in the other rooms, and when he found her, the argument didn't take long to start again, although this time it became increasingly violent. It was no longer just insults, but direct physical struggles and aggression. It was while they were fighting each other that Sue felt a stabbing pain in her stomach. When she looked down, she realized that her husband had stabbed her. Mike had a knife in his hand and seemed fully intent on continuing to attack her. So desperate, Sue tried to break free, but the businessman was much physically stronger, so he kept her close to him. In order to keep stabbing her, Sue, who was willing to do whatever it took to stop Mike from stabbing her again, put all her effort into calming him down. She told him that she wasn't going to get a divorce, that she wasn't going to leave him, and she promised all of this over and over again in an attempt to make him stop. According to her, Mike kept attacking her for a few minutes until he realized what was really happening. As if he hadn't been aware that he had been stabbing his wife. So at that moment, Mike panicked, grabbed the knife and left her alone in the room while he tried to decide what to do. A few minutes later, he went back into the room where Sue was losing a lot of blood, by the way, and told her he would call emergency services as long as she agreed to say that it had been an intruder who attacked her. The woman had no choice but to agree, despite not wanting to say it, as she needed to get to the hospital somehow. With Sue's complete information and certain evidence, like the deleted security recordings, the police arrested Mike on the charge of attempted murder. She notified Caroline, her eldest daughter in Chicago, about everything that had happened. Caroline didn't understand anything about the situation. Her father was known for having a calm personality. He was a sweet and caring man, incapable of doing something like that. Or at least that's what she said when she arrived in Gainesville to testify. Obviously, that's what she thought. Caroline had a complex relationship with her father, Sue. She explained how her father's wife was actually the one who became violent and not the other way around. In front of the investigators, she stated how her father had shown her bruises or even injuries that Sue had caused him during arguments several times the previous year. She even recounted an incident in which the woman had threatened him with a knife. It's quite a coincidence that she was attacked in the same way. The fact that the marriage was toxic was not news to the police or the prosecutor's office. Despite Caroline's statements, they officially charged Mike with attempting to murder his wife. The first court hearing took place in mid-February, and there, Mike told his version of what had happened in the early morning of February 3rd. The businessman confessed that he went out to dinner with his wife on the 2nd of that month and had an argument with her right in the restaurant. He said that for that reason, they both arrived home separately where they chose to sleep in different rooms. According to his story, after lying down alone for a while, Mike managed to calm down and decided to come down from the main bedroom to look for Sue in order to try to fix things between them. When he entered the guest room, he found his wife kneeling next to the bed with a knife in her hands. It seemed obvious that Sue was about to hurt herself, so he immediately entered the room and started struggling with her. In the middle of the struggle for the weapon, the knife slipped through his hand and injured him, but Sue got the worst of it as she ended up being stabbed. According to Mike's version, the whole situation had been accidental, but police reports and forensic findings indicated that this wasn't true. For example, the police report detailed how several drops of blood had been found on the bed. This indicated that Sue had been stabbed on the bed and not next to it, as the accused claimed. Another detail the police had noticed was that there was a strong smell of vomit and feces in the room. This was something Mike hadn't mentioned in his story, although when asked directly, he said it was because of the family dog. The testimony of several experts ruled out the possibility that Sue's wounds were self-inflicted or accidental. On the contrary, they confirmed that they were precise. In addition, Sue had other minor wounds that were consistent with attempts at self-defense and not with a struggle, as Mike had claimed. As this version was falling apart, Mike's defense tried a new strategy, focusing on Sue and portraying her as a violent, hostile, and aggressive woman, presenting as evidence dozens of messages between the couple in which she insulted or threatened her husband. To this, they added several posts that Mike had made on various men's forums, asking for advice and sharing his story as a victim of domestic violence. He described his life as a constant battle and said he needed someone who would understand him and be empathetic with him. The problem with this strategy was simple. Mike was a successful, wealthy, and educated man who had already been through a divorce. If he was so unhappy with Sue, why hadn't he tried to get a divorce? Why did he never report his situation to the police? These are things that victims of domestic violence are always questioned about. These questions are very common in those situations. That's not really the main problem. These are things that her defense focused on. But the most important thing to ask wasn't that. Rather, it was whether the story was real, as her lawyers suggested, and if Sue had orchestrated everything that happened in the early morning of February 3rd. Because by calling the police, Mike created the false story of a masked intruder. The prosecution's version had the answers. They believed that the message Susan had sent him hours earlier about the divorce had been the trigger. If they got divorced, Mike would be forced to give her a share of the money and real estate that belonged to him, and that made him furious. He didn't want to stay with her, that was clear, but he also didn't want to have to give her half of his things. So the only solution he found to separate from her and keep his things was to end the woman's life. In response to the prosecution's version, Mike's defense presented the testimony of a forensic doctor. Once on the stand, he focused on analyzing the crime scene. The expert discussed the bloodstains and their condition, according to the text. When the police arrived, they were able to confirm that the attack had happened at 3:30 in the morning, as Mike claimed, and not at midnight, as Sue said. However, this testimony had the opposite effect than expected when it was shown that the forensic expert actually no longer had a license because it had been revoked due to ethical issues. His name had been linked to several scandals, and therefore he was no longer considered trustworthy. The trial was extremely long. It was full of twists and turns, until in December 2019, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. When they returned after a few hours, they announced that they considered the millionaire Mike Reuschel, 63 years old, responsible for the charges that he was accused of, which were attempted murder, tampering with criminal evidence, and denying medical assistance to a victim. Days later, the judge in charge of the trial announced his sentence, 30 years in prison. Mike, who has no trouble paying his team of lawyers, tried several times to appeal the verdict, but nothing was achieved. In 2020, while Mike was already in prison, serving his sentence, rumors began to spread that the businessman was looking for contacts in prison who could take care of Sue. According to these rumors, Mike was more eager than ever to attack and get rid of the woman who had been his second wife. These rumors led the police to try to open an investigation around them, but there wasn't enough evidence to be able to accuse Mike of conspiracy to commit murder, so that's where the matter was left. As for Mike's sentence, it was known that Sue divorced him, although she had to go to court over the house where Cassie had died. From prison, the businessman gave orders to his lawyers to do everything so that Sue wouldn't keep the house, but this didn't succeed. The trial was favorable for Sue, who sold the house and tried to move on with her life while Mike remains in prison. And that's how we come to the end of the video. That's where the case ended, so tell me, did you know about this case? Did you know the story of Mike and Sue? I'll read your comments. You can also recommend cases for me to cover by email, preferably the one that's in the description of all the videos. Here are the patrons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those means, and with nothing more to say. Here you have a new video. Here you have a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.